the reason I'm here in Santa Barbara. It's the reason I do what I do in my life, and I bet there's a lot of you who can say the same, right? I know it's definitely one of every Unity minister I know, one of our favorite songs, so thank you. One day, a young boy decided to ask his dad, how did people get here? Where did it all start? His dad said, well, son, it's like this. Over hundreds of thousands of years, monkeys and apes kept evolving, and some of them became people. And that's how we got here. The next day, the boy decided to ask his mom the same question. Mom, how did people get here? Where did it all start? She said, well, son, it's like this. God created Adam and Eve, and we all descended from Adam and Eve. He gave her this kind of puzzled look and said, but Dad said, we all evolved from monkeys and apes. His mom said, well, son, it's like this. Your dad was talking about his side of the family. And I'm talking about my side of the family. If you've got a bulletin, I would invite you to pick it up again, and we're going to read our statement of faith one more time, and most of you know this by heart anyway, because this is Unity's first basic principle. So our statement of faith together: there is only one presence and one power in the universe and in my life, the infinite, loving, living presence of God. Sometimes fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists say, how can Unity say there is no devil, that there is no evil? After all, Jesus talks about both Satan and evil in the Gospels. For example, in Matthew 16:23, he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. That was the night before his crucifixion, and Peter wanted to fight. Then in John chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus says, Satan is a liar and the father of lies. And in Matthew 7, verse 11, Jesus said to the people who were around him, if you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, imagine how much more your heavenly parent will give good gifts to you. So let's talk about evil first. One day in the middle of winter, late in the afternoon at a northern university, a professor of philosophy decided to challenge his class. He said to them, did God create everything that exists? One student said, God definitely created everything that exists. The professor said, well, if that's the case, then God created evil, since evil exists. And if our work defines who we are, then that means God is evil. And he kind of smugly thought to himself that he had just disproved this myth called God. Another student raised his hand and said, Professor, I have a question for you. Does cold exist? The professor said, well, it certainly does. All you have to do is walk outside. It's the middle of winter. The student said, sir, you are mistaken. Cold actually does not exist, at least as a thing unto itself. We can study heat, but we cannot study cold, because cold is not a something. It's a nothing. It is simply the lack of heat. Professor, I have another question. Does darkness exist? It was already late in the afternoon. The professor said, well, all you have to do is look outside again and you see darkness. The student said, once again, Professor, you are mistaken. We can study light because there is a force called light. But we cannot actually study darkness because darkness is not a thing. It's a lack of a thing, the lack of light. The student went on to say, and Professor, what we call evil is simply the lack of God's love in our hearts. There is no such thing as evil. As I read this story, I looked at who the student was said to be. It was Albert Einstein who said that to the professor. Just because there's a force of light doesn't mean that there's a force of darkness. Just because there's a force or energy of heat doesn't mean there's a force or energy of cold. And just because there's a force and energy of goodness, of wholeness, doesn't mean that there is a force called evil. One day, the students of a certain rabbi got together and said, we want to talk to the rabbi because the problem of evil has gotten to be really bad and we want to drive it out of the world. So they asked the rabbi how to do that. The rabbi thought for a minute and he said to the students, I want you each to take a broom and I want you to go down into the dark basement and sweep the darkness out of the basement. The students said to themselves, well, clearly this is ridiculous, but we love our rabbi, so they did it. They came back upstairs. The rabbi said, were you able to sweep evil out of the dark? Of course not. One more thing, he said, now take a stick, each of you, take a big stick into that darkness and see if you can beat the darkness out. And of course, they came back up and said, once again, nothing. And then he said, now, I want each of you to light a candle and take that candle into the darkness and see what happens. And of course, we know exactly what happens because that is the way to deal with something that isn't actually a force, but a lack of something. The Aramaic word that Jesus used for evil is bisha, which actually means unripe or immature. And if we were to say, as he said in Matthew 7, if you then, being immature, know how to give good gifts to your children, imagine how much more your heavenly parent will give to you. In Romans 12, verse 21, Paul said, do not resist, and here's how we have it in our Bibles, do not resist evil, but overcome evil with good. That phrase, when we have the Aramaic understanding of it, would say, do not resist immaturity, but overcome immaturity with maturity. We say in Unity, when people act in what we call an evil manner, it only means that fear and not love runs their life. These two are actually our only choices. We're either in love or we're in fear. And fear is simply the lack of love. Now let's talk about the devil for a second. What Jesus called Satan. Satan is a Semitic word. It comes from the root sata, and it means to deceive, to cause to slip, or to slide, or to go astray. Every so often, you may have heard some part of Islamic fundamentalists call America the Great Satan. Have you ever heard that one? They say that because they see how many Americans put materialism first before God. So to Semitic people, Satan is anyone or anything that causes us to slip, to slide, or to go astray. And that included Peter for Jesus on the night before Jesus was crucified. Jesus knew what was coming, and he knew that it was an aspect of his ministry. He also knew that death isn't real, and it's not the enemy. Some Christian fundamentalists also say, I don't know, maybe you've heard this one. Satan's best trick is to convince us that he isn't real. Have you ever heard that one? I have. In response, I say, no. Satan's best trick is to convince us that he's outside of us. Some of you may recall the old comic strip Pogo. He used to say, "We has met the enemy and he is us." Jerry Jampolsky, the author of Love is Letting Go of Fear and the founder of the Attitudinal Healing Centers for Children with Catastrophic Conditions, once said, in the Bible, whenever you see the word Satan, you can substitute the word ego. And you remember that when I use the term ego, what I mean is the ego is who we believe we are when we feel separate from God and each other. The ego is a state of mind that causes us to slip, to slide, and to go astray. The ego is a liar, and it is the father of lies. For example, our ego would tell us that fear, lack, and separation are real, and that love, abundance, and oneness are not. Our ego would tell us that we have a will that's different from God's will. That's not true. We only have one will. It would also tell us that surrendering to God means loss, and that is also completely not true. Dr. Gary Simmons, the author of the wonderful book, The Eye of the Storm, which is going to be the basis of our workshop on Saturday, tells us one presence and one power means living with no one and nothing against us. Would you like to live with no one and nothing against you? Of course, we all would. Many of us have actually created a second power or an enemy. We say, yes, there's God. God is a power, but then there's also the evil force called cancer. Or we say, yes, there's God, and then there's an evil force called my angry boss, or that person who doesn't like me, or that person who gives me difficult times every time I see or hear him. Wayne Dyer's definition of ego is, I love this, is edging God out. And in one of Wayne Dyer's books, and by the way, this was after he had realized that he had leukemia, he said, in my world, nothing ever goes wrong. In my world, it's the same. When I was the transitional minister in Hartford, Connecticut, a woman came to see me and said that she had breast cancer, and she wanted some support. And as part of my support, I asked her if she would be willing to write a list called Something I Receive from Having Breast Cancer. She wrote 2 pages, 24 items. I'll read a few. First, I appreciate that this condition gave me the gift of time for inner growth. Probably nothing but a serious illness would have forced or encouraged me to stop and focus on my inner work. I stopped teaching. I stopped involvement in some activities that I really didn't like anyway. And I stopped interacting with some people I didn't enjoy interacting with. My illness gave me an opportunity for lots of self-work. It was an opportunity to release old baggage and anything that was unlike love. Also, I have learned more about being a gracious and grateful receiver of attention and expressions of love. I let other people help me. I began journaling as a result of my illness. I began journaling at the discovery of my tumor. Journaling is a wonderful addition to my life. I now write in an appreciation journal every day. And the last one I'm going to share with you is Kirk, that's her husband. Kirk being there for me in all settings, driving me places, just sitting with me. We shared love and tears and fears and growth. I feel very blessed by his loving support. And by the way, that was 12 years ago, and she is doing just fine today. One of my favorite Bible stories is about the Old Testament character Jacob. Because of Jacob's manipulation, he thought he had to manipulate everybody. He got kicked out of his house, of his home. He had to flee. So he was out alone in the desert. And he was thinking in the desert out there alone that there was no way to connect with God, because in those days, people believed that God lived where they lived. So if they weren't at home, there was no way to connect with God. But you may have read the story in Genesis where he goes to sleep at night in the desert, and he has a dream. The dream is of angels ascending to heaven, descending from heaven. And when he wakes up in the morning, he says, "Surely God is in this place, and I didn't know it." In the Bible, whenever you see the phrase "in the morning," it means when the light dawns on us. And so when Jacob woke up, he realized, surely God is in this place, and I just didn't know it. And also the word angel means messenger. So I have a question for you this morning. Is there somewhere in your life where God has seemed to be absent? Whenever we have a difficult or painful experience, it's a wake-up call. It's a messenger. It's an angel. And when we realize that that's what it is, when we realize this is not here to harm me, it's here to give me a gift, we too say, surely God is in this experience, and I just didn't know it. When I was the minister in Unity of Key West, I joined together with some other ministers, some other Christian ministers, in a service for all about AIDS. It was National AIDS Day, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the speakers said, of course, he thought of God as being this old man in the sky. And so he said, "Why does God allow AIDS?" Well, in Unity, we know that God isn't a being. God is the very force of love. In fact, whenever anybody asks me what is your concept of God? I say, that concept in Star Wars called the Force? To me, that's the closest thing I know to describe my relationship with Spirit or with God in us. H. Emily Cady, in her book, Lessons in Truth, says, God is not a being with qualities or attributes. Rather, God is the good itself coming into expression as love, as power, as wisdom, and as life energy. And I wanted to also share with you a quote from a student of Stephen Levine, who said, 3 years ago, I was graced with cancer. He said, I looked my whole life for a teacher. And it wasn't until I got cancer that I really started to pay attention to the preciousness of each breath, to the momentum of each thought, till I saw that this moment is all. He said, all my other teachers gave me ideas. This teacher, perhaps we could say this angel, caused me to directly experience my life. When I got cancer, it was up to me to get born before I died. And finally, from Dr. Bernie Siegel, whose books on healing are the best ones I've ever found. This was in Love, Medicine, and Miracles. He said, when I speak to 500 people with AIDS about the value of their illness, the gift and challenge it represents, and nobody tries to remove me from the stage, I know how courageous these people are and how much they have learned about healing. So how do we experience one presence and one power in daily life? We experience it as divine love, both toward other people and from other people. We experience it as the power of creation, when we actually get to the point of realizing nothing happens to me. Everything happens through me. We experience it as divine guidance, when we're open to receive it instead of just believing our intellect is all we have. And we experience it as divine, as vibrant aliveness. In Romans 8:28, Paul says, all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to God's purpose. All things really do work together for good, as long as we know that our one true purpose here on planet Earth is to heal our sense of separation from Spirit and to realize or make real our oneness with God, our oneness with others, and our oneness with all creation. So if there's anywhere in your life where it seems God isn't present here, ask the Holy Spirit in you to reveal it as the angel that it is. The Holy Spirit is the aspect of us, the aspect of God that constantly draws us toward becoming all that we've always been in potential, or all we've always been at our core, which is divine. Or even better, join us this Saturday morning for the Eye of the Storm. Join us if you can, because I will tell you that there are lots of ways that your success in life will improve, having been here as a part of this concept. I will also tell you that the concepts that we will be talking about Saturday and Sunday are the basis of a healthy, functional, thriving ministry. So if that's something that you're interested in, I really hope you'll be there. As you learn how to turn problems into blessings, you will join Jacob and me in saying, surely God is in this place, and I just didn't know it. Namaste.